Good morning, everyone. It is October 30th, and before I get started with what I want to talk about, just know that my last video went under community guidelines violation for being violent. It wasn't violent. It didn't show any guts. It didn't show any gore. It didn't even show a firefight. It was just that accident that the Russians had. I don't even think it showed anyone getting killed. It was silly. But if you want to see the whole video, go to my YouTube, and I would really appreciate it if you'd follow me on YouTube, because I would really like to migrate over there, because TikTok is really oppressive for creators like me who are vehemently anti-Chinese Communist Party and anti-Putin Kremlin regime. So if you could go over there, go to my profile, click the play button, you can see that video that was taken down. Moving on, just some quick news before I go to the story I want to talk about today. The Black Sea Fleet was attacked by drones. These were seaborne and airborne drones. No word yet on what the entire battle damage assessment would be. Russia's saying nothing happened. Others are saying that a ship was sunk. I don't know, but something certainly did happen, because Russia got all poopy pants about it and pulled out of the Ukraine grain deal. The Ukrainian Air Force is going to be sending pilots here soon to the U.S. to train on F-15 and F-16s. The budget from the U.S. on this is $100 million. And then for those of you that were concerned about the new Italian Prime Minister potentially supporting Russia, you can kind of set those fears aside, because it seems like she is definitely in Ukraine's camp, as she is upping the military aid for Ukraine, as they're going to send 2 multiple launch rocket systems, some 6 howitzers, and some M113 armored vehicles. Now, as I kind of leave the news, I want to talk about this story I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. As we kind of celebrate Ukraine's ability to punch above its weight against Russia in this kind of David versus Goliath story, we've been really excited to see how good the Ukrainians have been in this fight. But many years before the invasion, the U.S. started seeing the cracks in the Russian military might. And this was somewhat exposed in 2018 during a 4-hour-long battle that took place in Syria between the United States military as well against a combination of Russian PMC Wagner mercenaries and Syrian fighters. So when the U.S. launched Operation Inherent Resolve in 2014, the goal was to destroy ISIS, the Islamic State. They actually allied with the Russians to destroy ISIS because they saw the common enemy. During this time, the U.S. has always allied with the Kurds in that region. Meanwhile, the Russians have allied with Bashar al-Assad's Syrian forces, who are perennially an evil group of people. But they found common ground in fighting ISIS. Now, against that backdrop, Russia and the U.S. opened up a communications line to avoid direct conflict with each other. Well, in February of 2018, after about 3 years of not having any conflict, it seems like Russia and the U.S. were going to come to blows for the first time since World War I. And it was about a 4-hour battle in which 500 soldiers, a mix of Wagner mercenaries and Syrian fighters, decided they were going to take on 30 soldiers from the 1st Special Forces Operation Detachment and 75th Ranger Regiment, and they were promptly skull-fucked by the Americans. The Russians were. So the Americans were also supported by a platoon of infantry Marines and some Army Special Forces personnel, feeding surveillance and reconnaissance information to the soldiers 20 miles away. These soldiers were at the Conoco outpost protecting basically a fuel plant or an oil plant. So the U.S. forces had about 80 to 90 folks on the ground versus these 500 Russian PMC and Syrian fighter mix. Now, the Joint Special Operations Command brass that were monitoring the situation were somewhat baffled that they saw a massive enemy force positioning itself to attack the outpost. And the Americans knew that Russians were involved. There was Russian Wagner Group mercenaries in that mix, and that was being reported. Over the course of the day, the contingent of 30 Delta Force and Ranger soldiers started planning with those Marine platoon and Joint Special Operations Command for a QRF of Marines to potentially support these special operators at the Conoco plant. The 500 fighters from the Russian side started moving in closer and brought with them 27 vehicles, including Russian-made T-72 battle tanks. Now, as they were watching this buildup to take place, plans were being made on the U.S. side. Now, around 10 p.m. on February 7th in 2018, the joint Russian and Syrian forces began to bombard the Conoco outpost with artillery and mortar rounds. And so the U.S. service members started firing warning shots with their small arms fire. Now, during the opening minutes of the battle, Secretary of Defense at the time, James Mattis, contacted their Russian counterparts and said, hey, you're fighting Americans here. The Russian high command in Syria assured the U.S. that it was not their people fighting against the Americans. Now, after this assurance was kind of back and forth for 15 minutes, the U.S. said annihilate the enemy force, flat out. It said, Chief of Staff General Dunford said, annihilate him. That was his exact words. So the soldiers on the ground started returning fire with javelin anti-tank fire, and they reported that the air was filled with dust and shrapnel. Now, when this started, the U.S. Marines and Special Operations Forces, which they were from, Special Operations Forces Detachment Delta, which is Delta Force, they started calling in for air support. The air support started coming out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar and included strike packages from Reaper drones, F-22 fighter jets, which are the stealth variant, F-15E Strike Eagles, B-52s, AC-130s, AH-64 Apache helicopters, and the kitchen sink. The Americans don't fuck around. They threw the whole thing at them. And for the next 3 hours, American officials called in scores of airstrikes pummeling these Russians and Syrian troops, including tanks on the ground. The Marines supported that with rocket artillery fire from nearby bases. Unfortunately, the quick reaction force was not very quick. It took another 3.5 hours for them to get there because they were driving in MRAPs, which are wheeled vehicles. They didn't have tracked vehicles, and the roads were pretty cratered, and there's power lines down, and it was just a chaotic battlefield to try and get wheeled vehicles in. So it took them a while to get there. They were driving under night vision so that they wouldn't give away their position, so they had no headlights. So it was difficult rowing, so to speak. Now, the artillery that was coming from the Russian side was also targeting the quick reaction force as well, which leads everyone to believe that this is definitely Russia guiding this situation. Well, the QRF finally arrived at the outpost around 1:30 a.m., like I said, about 3.5 hours after the fight started, and the Russians started ditching their vehicles. This QRF had about 16 Marines, and as the Delta operators, the Green Berets, the 75th Ranger guys were all fighting from their vehicles, the Marines provided logistic support by pushing ammunition and other means of support to them. At the same time, Air Force combat controllers were calling in airstrikes, and some of them even exposed themselves. They were calling in airstrikes for everything from drones to fighters to B-52 bombers. Now, this is interesting because it's the first time against what we would consider a Russian force. This is the same Russian force that's fighting in Ukraine. These PMC, the private military contractors from Wagner, faced a combined arms fight from the U.S. This is Air Force, Army, Marine Corps, basically every damn buddy but the now Space Force and the Navy and the Coast Guard. At least one of the Marines took enemy fire but was uninjured, and as they called in airstrikes. Now, these mercenaries and the Syrian fighters gave up around 2:30 a.m. after 4 hours of fighting. In the aftermath of the slaughter, Russia's state media downplayed the battle. Maria Zakharova, who we see often now, the press secretary for the foreign ministry, said only 5 Russian contractors were killed. According to audio recordings from the fight, Russian mercenaries said we should have never been there. Our leadership messed up. The Americans knew exactly where we were. One Wagner Group veteran recorded, to make it short, we had our fucking asses kicked. He went on to say, yeah, so our squadron fucking lost 200 people immediately. Another one lost 10 people. I don't know about the third squadron, but it got torn up pretty badly. They tore us to pieces. Incidentally, at the end of the fighting, 300 Syrian and Russian forces were killed to 0 Americans killed. Not a single American was even wounded. In fact, the only wounded on our side was a Syrian fighter, and he would go on to recover. Interestingly, the lopsided American victory worked as a deterrent a month later when Syrian fighters and Russian mercenaries began a similar buildup near the Euphrates, but this time when Mattis called Russia, the enemy forces dispersed. So just let that be a lesson. This was 80 American fighters that basically drug the Russians and Syrians across the fucking desert as if they were a doll. 500 to 80. We lost none. Y'all lost 200 to 300.